The war with Iran is no longer just a war with Iran. That is the first thing we need to understand. This is no longer a narrow regional conflict. It is no longer just about missiles, drones, oil tankers, Israeli security, or Iranian nuclear ambitions. What we are watching now is a stress test of the entire international system. The question is not only whether the United States can force Iran to surrender. The question is whether the United States still has the power to force the world to accept its version of reality. Because right now, that power is being tested in real time. Energy markets are shaking. Oil inventories are being drained. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer functioning the way the world economy needs it to function. Gulf states are nervous. Europe is post. Asia is calculating. China is watching. Russia is watching. Emerging economies are already feeling the pressure of higher fuel, higher food, higher transportation costs, and higher debt burdens. And yet inside the United States, the war continues almost as if the public does not exist. No serious national debate. No real congressional authorization. No clear explanation from the president. No honest accounting of the cost. Just daily posts, contradictory statements, threats, slogans, and the same old assumption that Washington can start a war, finance it through debt, and expect the rest of the world to adjust. But this time, the world may not adjust the way it used to. That is the danger. The American public is not being asked to support this war in the old-fashioned way. There is no draft. There is no tax increase presented honestly as a war tax. There is no national speech explaining the sacrifice. The cost is hidden inside deficits, inflation, energy prices, gasoline prices, food prices, airline costs, fertilizer costs, petrochemical costs, and the slow erosion of living standards. So people feel the war before they fully understand it. They feel it at the pump. They feel it at the grocery store. They feel it in travel costs. They feel it when everything that depends on oil, transportation, plastic, fertilizer, shipping, or energy becomes more expensive. And still, the machinery keeps moving. That is the core of the problem. This war is not being driven by popular demand. It is not being driven by a clear national consensus. It is being driven by a security state that still believes America should run the world. That mindset is old, but it is not gone. It says the Western Hemisphere belongs to Washington. Europe is treated like a group of dependent states. The Gulf monarchies are treated as military platforms. Israel is treated as a protected strategic instrument. And Iran is seen as the last major holdout in the Middle East. That is why Iran matters so much. Iran is not simply another country on a map. It is the state that refused to return to the American-led regional order after the 1979 revolution. It is the country that once sat under American imperial influence after the 1953 coup, when a democratic government was overthrown and replaced with the Shah's police state. For Washington's strategic class, Iran is not just a current enemy. It is unfinished business. It is the one that got away. And now the old project has returned under a new label. The language changes. The slogans change. Sometimes it is about nuclear weapons. Sometimes it is about terrorism. Sometimes it is about regional stability. Sometimes it is about protecting Israel. But underneath all of that, the deeper objective remains control. Control the Middle East. Control energy. Control the Gulf. Control the choke points. Control the states that refuse to align. Control the global system before China, Russia, Iran, India, and other regional powers turn multipolarity from a slogan into reality. That is the real fear in Washington. Not just that Iran could enrich uranium. Not just that Hezbollah could survive. Not just that the Strait of Hormuz could be threatened. The fear is that the world is moving beyond unipolar American command. And Iran is one of the places where that transition becomes visible. Now let's talk about Israel, because no serious analysis of this war can avoid it. Israel sees Iran as the central supporter of forces that challenge Israeli dominance in the region. Iran supports the Palestinian cause. Iran supports the idea that Palestinians must have political rights, statehood, or at least a political future that Israel cannot simply erase. Israel's current leadership rejects that. Its position, in practice, is not compromise. It is domination. The West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, southern Lebanon, parts of Syria, all of these become part of a broader project of security through expansion and control. That is why Iran is unacceptable to Israel. Not only because of missiles, not only because of nuclear technology, but because Iran gives political, military, and ideological depth to the resistance against Israeli regional dominance. So in this war, Washington and Israel have overlapping goals. The United States wants Iran brought back under the imperial structure. Israel wants Iran weakened so that the Palestinian cause and the wider resistance network lose their strongest state supporter. And the American security state, now deeply intertwined with parts of Silicon Valley, sees something else: opportunity. War has become a laboratory, a place to test weapons, a place to test AI systems, a place to integrate surveillance, targeting, drones, data platforms, battlefield algorithms, and automated decision-making. For the companies building these tools, war is not only a tragedy. It is a market, it is research and development, it is field testing, it is stock prices, it is contracts, it is influence inside government. That is one of the ugliest truths of modern war. The public sees destruction. The defense sector sees data. The family sees a dead child. The weapons company sees system performance. The ordinary citizen sees rising prices. The billionaire sees a portfolio going up. That is why wars like this are so difficult to stop. The people who pay the cost are not the people who profit from the continuation. And that leads us to the central military problem. The United States and Israel cannot actually win this war without triggering disaster. The original idea appears to have been simple, even simplistic. Strike Iran hard, shock the system, kill or destabilize the leadership, create a pathway to regime change, install a more compliant government, or force Tehran to accept American demands. But Iran did not collapse. The leadership did not fold in one day. The country did not disintegrate. The military did not disappear. And now Washington is stuck. It cannot easily invade Iran. Iran is a large country with around 90 million people, deep geography, mountains, cities, strategic depth, and a population with a strong national identity. A ground invasion would be catastrophic, and Americans have no appetite for it. So what remains? Bombing. More bombing. Threats of more bombing. Demands that Iran accept a long list of American conditions. But on what basis? If the United States cannot enforce those demands without a wider catastrophe, then the demands are not strategy. They are wishful thinking. That is why the war has become trapped in stalemate. Washington can inflict damage. Israel can inflict damage. Iran can retaliate. The Gulf can be destabilized. Oil can be disrupted. But none of that produces a clean political victory. And the longer this continues, the more the global economic danger grows. The Strait of Hormuz is the key. If only a few ships are moving through Hormuz every day, the world economy cannot simply shrug that off forever. Oil stockpiles are not infinite. Strategic reserves are not magic. Europe, Asia, Africa, and emerging markets all depend on flows of energy that cannot be replaced overnight. When those flows slow down, the consequences arrive in waves. First, oil prices rise. Then transport costs rise. Then food prices rise because fertilizer, shipping, diesel, and logistics become more expensive. Then emerging economies with high sovereign debt face a brutal squeeze. They must pay more for energy, more for food, more for imports, and more to service debt. Then political instability grows. Then rationing begins. Then factories slow. Then inflation hits households already living on the edge. That is how a war in the Gulf becomes a global economic crisis. Not instantly. Not all at once. But through pressure that accumulates until the system cracks. Right now, markets are living in a kind of temporary fantasy. Stock prices may remain high. Tech billionaires may still look at their portfolios and feel confident. Silicon Valley may see opportunity in military AI. But if the physical economy breaks, the financial bubble will not be immune forever. There is a limit to how long asset prices can ignore energy reality. There is a limit to how long traders can price in peace while ships avoid Hormuz. There is a limit to how long the world can pretend a major energy choke point is only a regional detail. If the war escalates, the result could be a global calamity. If Trump follows through on threats to devastate Iran, Iran will not simply stand there. Iran could strike back across the region. It could target energy infrastructure. It could hit Gulf facilities. It could deepen the crisis in Hormuz. It could make the entire region uninsurable and unstable. That would not only be an Iranian crisis, it would be a world crisis. If the current pattern continues, no full escalation, but constant skirmishing, restricted shipping, falling reserves, and no durable settlement, then the crisis comes more slowly. Oil prices climb again. Inventories continue falling. Confidence erodes. Countries begin rationing. Inflation spreads. That is the slow path to crisis. And then there is the rational path. The United States simply pulls back. It does not need to call it defeat. Trump can call it victory if he wants. He can say every objective was achieved. He can say America restored peace. He can say he deserves every prize in the world. The label is less important than the action. Just stop. Pull back. Reopen the strait. Let energy flows resume. Let the world breathe. That is the only outcome that avoids the worst damage. But But the problem is that empires rarely admit mistakes quickly. They prefer to double down. They prefer to make demands. They prefer to pretend the original plan still exists, even after reality has destroyed it. That is why this moment is so dangerous. Now let's return to Israel and Lebanon. Iran has repeatedly argued that any ceasefire or de-escalation must include Lebanon. That makes sense from Tehran's perspective because Hezbollah is not a side issue. Hezbollah is part of the regional balance. If Israel continues bombing Lebanon while Washington claims diplomacy is alive, then Iran sees that as bad faith. And yet Israel continues. Why does the Trump administration not restrain Israel? The answer is uncomfortable because it can, but it does not want to. The United States has enormous leverage over Israel. It provides weapons, funding, diplomatic cover, intelligence, and protection in international forums. If an American president truly said, "Stop now" or "Support ends," Israel would have to stop very quickly. The idea that Israel dictates terms to the United States is too simple. The deeper truth is that many powerful people inside the United States have fused Israeli objectives with American objectives. They no longer distinguish between what is good for the United States and what is desired by Israel's most extreme leaders. That is not the same thing as Israel controlling America from the outside. It is worse in some ways. It means parts of the American political class have internalized another country's maximalist agenda as if it were their own. And then there is the money. Arms manufacturers benefit. Military technology companies benefit. AI defense firms benefit. Lobbyists benefit. Politicians benefit. Donors benefit. War creates contracts, influence, testing grounds, and narratives of necessity. So when people ask why the war does not stop, the answer is not only ideology, it is also profit. Perpetual war has become an economic model. The rest of society gets poorer, but the war sectors get richer. That is why public opinion can oppose the war, and the war can still continue. If 60% of Americans oppose the conflict and only a minority supports it, that should matter in a democracy. But if the war is financed by debt, insulated from direct sacrifice, and protected by elite interest, public opposition becomes easier to ignore. That is the crisis of American democracy in foreign policy. The public pays. The public suffers. But the public does not decide. Now, zoom out. This war is happening inside a world that is no longer unipolar. Washington may still think in the language of 1992, when the United States saw itself as the sole superpower after the Soviet collapse. That mentality never fully disappeared. The strategy remained. Prevent Russia from rising again, contain China, dominate the Middle East, control the Americas, keep Europe subordinate, and manage the global financial system through sanctions, tariffs, debt, and dollar power. But the world has changed. China is not a weak state waiting to be contained. Russia is not a defeated post-Soviet fragment that can be endlessly pushed without response. India is rising as a major power. Iran, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, Pakistan, and others are regional powers with their own interests. The global majority does not want to be forced into a new Cold War architecture. Many countries do not oppose the United States outright, but they also want good relations with China. They want options. They want alternatives. They want settlement systems outside the dollar. They want trade routes not controlled by Washington. They want national security not dependent on American mood swings. That is why de-dollarization is not just a financial slogan. It is a political reaction. The more the United States uses sanctions, asset seizures, tariffs, and financial pressure as weapons, the more other countries ask a basic question: are we safe inside this system? If Iranian assets can be frozen or seized, who is next? If Russia can be cut off, who is next? If dollar access can become a political weapon, why should any major power keep all of its eggs in that basket? This war accelerates those questions. It tells the world that the United States is willing to weaponize finance, energy, shipping, military power, and alliance structures to maintain dominance. And that forces other countries to build alternatives. Not overnight, not perfectly, but steadily. That is the long-term consequence Washington may be underestimating. A war launched to preserve American hegemony may accelerate the erosion of American hegemony. That is the paradox. The United States tries to show it still runs the world, and the world responds by looking for ways not to be run by the United States. The Gulf states will have to recalibrate. They may still depend on American weapons, but Europe will have to recalibrate. It may still be tied to NATO, but it is increasingly aware of the cost of strategic dependency. Asia will recalibrate because Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, and India all understand the danger of energy disruptions. driven by decisions made in Washington and Tel Aviv. And China sees the whole board. It knows the United States is overextended. It knows the Gulf matters. It knows Iran matters. It knows Russia matters. It knows that the global economy does not want endless war. China does not need to fire a missile to gain influence. It can present itself as the adult in the room, the power that wants stability, trade, energy flow, development, and multipolar settlement. Whether that image is fully honest is a separate question. But geopolitically, it is effective. If Washington looks like the arsonist and Beijing looks like the firefighter, many countries will listen to Beijing. That is the shift. And the American security state does not seem ready to accept it. It still believes 4% of the world's population can run the other 96% if it has enough aircraft carriers, sanctions, drones, dollars, and compliant allies. That is delusional. Power still matters. America remains enormously powerful. Its military finance, technology, and institutions are still formidable. But power is not the same as omnipotence, and the difference is becoming painfully visible. Iran has shown resilience. Russia has survived pressure that Washington expected would break it. China has refused to buckle under trade war pressure. The global south is more willing to hedge. Europe is uneasy. The Gulf is exposed. The dollar system is being questioned. And the American public is tired. That is the real background to the Iran war. It is not simply a conflict over one country. It is the collision between an old imperial mindset and a new multipolar reality. The old mindset says, we give orders. The new reality says, not everyone will obey. The old mindset says, we can sanction, bomb, threaten, and dominate. The new reality says, those tools have costs. The old mindset says, the world has no alternative. The new reality says, alternatives are being built precisely because of how the United States behaves. And that is why this war is so important. If Washington escalates, it may trigger a global economic shock. If it continues the current path, it may slowly drain energy reserves and push the world toward crisis. If it pulls back, it can reduce the damage. But it must accept that it failed to impose its full will. That is the choice. Escalation, slow crisis, or retreat disguised as victory. For ordinary people, the third option is clearly the best. For the security state, it is the hardest to accept. Because the security state does not like to admit limits. But limits are real. Iran cannot be easily invaded. Israel cannot be made permanently safe through endless regional war. The Gulf cannot be protected from every drone, missile, and shock. The world economy cannot absorb indefinite disruption at Hormuz. The American budget cannot finance endless wars without consequences. The dollar cannot be weaponized forever without encouraging alternatives. And the American people cannot be expected to suffer higher prices while billionaires and defense contractors profit from the chaos. That is the message leaders in Washington need to hear. Stop before you wreck everything. Not because Iran is innocent. Not because the world is simple. Not because there are no hard security questions, but because the current path leads toward disaster. A rational policy would recognize reality. The world is multipolar. Iran is not going to disappear. China is not going to kneel. Russia is not going to be dismantled according to an old Washington fantasy. The Gulf states are not permanent possessions. Europe is not a Roman province. The global south is not waiting for orders. The United States can still be powerful in this world. It can still lead. It can still cooperate. It can still prosper. But only if it gives up the fantasy that leadership means domination. That is the deeper lesson of this war. The Iran war was launched to preserve American primacy. But each week it continues, it exposes the weakness beneath that primacy. It exposes the debt. It exposes the industrial limits. It exposes the political corruption. It exposes the dependence on lobbies and weapons firms. It exposes the fragility of global supply chains. It exposes the fact that the world economy can be shaken by a single choke point. And most of all, it exposes that the American empire is no longer operating in the world of 1992. That world is gone. The new world is not fully formed yet, but it is arriving. It is multipolar. It is more resistant. It is more suspicious of Washington. It is more willing to trade outside old channels. It is more aware that sanctions and asset seizures can one day be aimed at anyone. And it is watching Iran closely. Because if Iran survives this pressure, the lesson for the rest of the world will be clear. American power can still destroy, but it can no longer always dictate. That is a historic shift. So the real question is not whether Trump can claim victory. He can always claim victory. The real question is whether the world still believes the claim. And right now, more and more countries are looking at the war, the economic damage, the energy shock, the Israeli escalation, the American confusion, the rising debt, the stock market fantasy, the Silicon Valley war profits, and the empty language of hegemony. And they are reaching their own conclusion. The old order is cracking, and the people trying hardest to preserve it may be the ones breaking it fastest.